Well, greetings everybody on the call. I see it is 4:02, and I just want to don my hat of the convener of this seminar series to say a word or two before I have the person introducing the speaker come on and introduce the speaker, and we'll listen to the speaker. I would like to take the opportunity to recognize all of my colleagues who are here present. I see Dean Gray, our department chair. I also recognize, interestingly, the author who is the subject of discussion is on the call. So I want to recognize him also and recognize all and sundry logging in from all the four corners of this world. So I will be introducing Ms. Victoria Walker, who is our own she's a political science major, a sophomore, and she will take a few minutes, acquaint us to the speaker, and then the speaker, Dr. Fishkin, will then tell us what he has in store for us. So without further ado, I would call on Ms. Victoria Walker to introduce the speaker. Victoria Walker, you have the floor. You can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Indy. Good evening, everyone. I'm Victoria Walker, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for this TU seminar for the 2022-2023 school year, Dr. Benjamin Hart Fishkin. Dr. Benjamin Hart Fishkin has been writing about African authors for the most of the past 8 years. His work on authors such as Francis Nyomja, Thomas Jing, and Emmanuel Fru Doh has resulted in several collaborative book projects, including Fear, Doubting Joys of Belonging in 2013, Secrets, Silences, and Betrayals, written in 2015, Living Independence, Critical Perspective on Global Interdependence, written in 2018, and most recently, The Absurd in the Cameroonian Tragedy of Colonization, The Writings of Emmanuel Fru Doh in 2022, which is due this October. In his research in Africa, he has emphasized the disorder and distemper that seems to accompany colonialization, specifically European colonialization. Joining the Tuskegee University faculty in 2009, his literary work involved 19th century British literature through each phase of his education. Prior to his doctorate from the University of Alabama in May of that same year, he obtained a BA in English and Film, University of Ann Arbor, and an MA from Miami University, Oxford, Ohio, where he examined the interest of Charles Dickens in the theater and how the stage influenced his novel writing. He has published The Undependable Bonds of Blood, The Unanticipated Problems of Parenthood in the novels of Henry James, written in 2011. The emphasis here being that family life can easily be a hindrance as well as a hope. His work after being involved with Henry James includes, amongst other things, the problems of marriage and the American family and the relationship between the blues and the single parent in the works of William Faulkner, August William, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Professor Fishkin has lived in New York, Ohio, Alabama, California, Michigan, Florida, Washington, and England. Before taking up this position at Tuskegee University, Professor Fishkin was a junior fellow in the Blount Undergraduate Initiative at the University of Alabama. He has won several distinguished awards, including the Buford Boone Memorial Fellowship, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival Scholarship Award, and the George Mills Harper Graduate Student Travel Award. If everyone could please unmute themselves just for a quick second for me, and please join me in giving Dr. Benjamin Hart Fishkin a big TU welcome. I'm not seeing a lot of people unmute. Okay, some more.
So good to be here.
You
You.
know,
You know.
You.
Say one
you,
know.
time.
you know,
You.
You
you
know.
know.
No.
You.
Okay, Dr. Fish, can I give you the floor?
Okay, thank you, Victoria. And thanks everybody for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and attend an event like this. Okay. Just before I start, I'd like to say that it's really a blessing that we can all get together and do something like this. And, really thank God for, for events like this and for the beautiful literature that I'm going to be talking about. Okay. Now, where to get started here? Okay. A while ago, I started to talk about and read about and think about African literature, okay? And quite simply, one of my first reactions was this, okay? More than 10 years ago, I was talking to somebody at the university here who said to me that whenever she thought about Africa or looked at things about Africa or spent any kind of time discussing Africa, she had this incredible urge to cry or to weep because things were so complicated and so messed up and so inexplicable in their surroundings and inexplicable in the way things were going on. Okay, so before I really start, the word that I keep coming back to, and I thought about including something like this in the book as sort of a epitaph or something, is the word clutter, okay? And what I really am going to be talking about, yes, I'll have stories and anecdotes and details to give you, but really about the problems of the mind, the human mind, when it is cluttered, and especially when it is unnecessarily cluttered. So that's going to be one of the things that I try to get across to you. And here we go. So let's get started. This past Sunday, I was in the chapel when we were having our convocation, listening to Harry L. Williams, who is the head of the Thurgood Marshall College Fund. And he was giving his speech and he said, the key to success is balance. And I felt my heart drop to the bottom of my feet because this man is giving away the goods that I want to present in 4 or 5 days. And he was unintentionally, of course, and maybe not with the same emphasis, but yes, the key to success is a form of balance. And he kept going and he said, you have to emphasize faith and you have to emphasize family as things that you can't do without. And I then thought, if I could get my heart lower than the bottom of my feet, it would be there, because he was stealing my thunder. And that's exactly really what I want to talk to you about today. The need for balance, okay? And what I think the need for balance should indicate for everybody is the idea of there being sort of a sturdiness in your life, okay? That there are things that you can count upon, that'll be there tomorrow, and they'll be more or less the way you left them today. even the whole incident of having a sort of pathway in your daily life. I spoke with the author in June, not June a few months ago, but the previous June. And one of the things we spoke about briefly was how nice it was to, in the morning, for example, to drive to your way to work and to stop at the same sort of, coffee shop or equivalent, and to get a cup of coffee, and you knew where the coffee shop was, you knew what kind of coffee you wanted, you knew what it cost, you knew when you were where you were gonna park, and you even might know the name and a few details about the person selling it to you. Well, none of that exists in Cameroon, unfortunately, and it hasn't existed that way for quite some time. Basically, everyone in Cameroon is caught in kind of like a swirling cloud or a tempest or something like that. And basically, there's sort of confusion and a lack of clarity, which at first you might say, well, that's not that big of a deal. But I'm here to say it is that big of a deal. And a little later on, I'll talk about this, that this kind of confusion, which is there intentionally, can do more than just have someone have, let's say, a bad day or something like that. It's not about having a bad day or even a bad week or something like that. This can really threaten the emotional health and sanity of the individuals that are involved, okay? So when I began to write The Absurd and the Cameroonian Tragedy at Decolonialization, I'm trying to isolate what causes the tragedy. And Professor Doh, Emmanuel Fru Doh, provides anecdotes that tell us really the consequences of people who have been really, to some degree, forgotten and left to suffer. So, quoting again Harry Williams, the biggest problem here is family life, or the lack of it, or some might even say the dismantling of family life that was once really a wonderful thing, a lovely thing, okay? And somehow the bricks of all of that have been pulled out of the foundation. In one of his works called The Fire Within, the main character, Mungeu, graduates from school, okay, and none of her family shows up. None of her parents show up, none of her stepmothers show up, okay. She does have one stepsister who is the exception to the rule, but you can see how it's very clear that this is really nature's way, or the author's way, of telling you that something's very wrong. Now, here's what is wrong. The nation has been split down the middle. This is Cameroon. And basically, since 1961, the political reality is that trying to connect with perhaps Scotch tape, okay, the southern British Cameroons were forced to join La République de Cameroon. And we have from the very start what I've seen in many books referred to as something like a shotgun marriage, okay, where the surroundings are messed up. The implication is that they're messed up for many reasons, but one has to do with colonialism, especially in this example, where the French are making all of the decisions, all the meaningful ones anyway, about what goes on in Cameroon. Now, back in the 60s, Ahmadou Ahidjo basically had bad faith dealings with the English-speaking side of the country, and they were sort of left without power and without any kind of shelter. I'm not talking about literal shelter, but I'll call it emotional shelter. Now, Mungeu is also like an orphan who has no shelter. Her mother died in childbirth, and she's basically going to have her life all torn apart, okay? And it's all ultimately unnecessary, okay? As we talk about colonialism, in another novel called Boundaries, we have a woman, Tondre, who quite simply goes through a breakdown. She never sees a doctor in the novel, but it's clear she's really suffering and needs one. And in my talks with Emmanuel Fru Doh, he told me, and his novel told me, that in the whole country, there is only one hospital that deals with emotional type issues, and they speak only in French. So somebody who doesn't know French, you know, imagine how you can deal with a medical emergency in a language you understand. Think about how stressful it is to deal with one where you don't. The two women in these two novels, Tonde and Mungeu, quite simply suffer, and the suffering comes at least initially from parenting, okay, or the lack of it, or the breaking down of it. They don't have stability, and it was once thought that stability in the family was one of the things that Africans did better than anybody, okay? And I think that was true up until a point where Ahidjo had power from the 60s and 70s until the very, very early 80s. And at some point in the game, it was really clear that there was a problem. I'm sorry, can someone please mute your mic? So, thank you very much. Okay, so here we have two young women in an environment where it's really impossible to get anything done, okay? And all of this negativity that Professor Doh talks about is there, but he does have this hint of hope, I'll call it, or resilience, that someday things are going to work out better. And I really hope and pray that is the case. But you really have to look very hard for evidence to this effect. Okay. He also said something about, it's about young people in Cameroon, Cameroonians who are very young, who have no recollection of the 1992 state of emergency when President Paul Biya was involved with an election that most people thought was not a legitimate one. I'll just leave it at that. And basically that he had more time when people in the nation wanted him out. Okay. Unfortunately, I look at Cameroon as sort of always being an underdog, but really these are ways of description that are not necessary. It seems to me that these kinds of problems and issues are tragic, but I always get the expression or hope that it doesn't really have to be this way. And basically, the nation could be one that has institutions that people can count on. Now, I'm going to get away from my text to talk about a couple of things that at first you would think just can't be happening, or they shouldn't be happening, or I don't believe that they could happen at all. One was one of the characters in one of the novels goes to get a passport, goes to the passport office, and they've run out of the booklets on which the passports should be printed. And I wonder, how can that happen? I mean, how can such a thing happen? It doesn't seem possible. Also, Professor Doh told me about what it's like to go and get a driver's license. And if you go on the wrong day and the person who's really in charge there isn't there, they'll tell you you have to come back. And all of this is because he's expecting a bribe. And if you got your license the day you came, he wouldn't get it. So he's saying essentially, come back another day so I can get paid, or paid a little bit more beyond my salary. Okay. So these are the kinds of situations that you're saying just can't happen, or they just shouldn't happen, but they do. In another author that I've looked at, Francis Namajo, spoke about how people, somebody wanted to get a job, but there was an age limitation on the job. So he went somewhere and paid someone $5 to get a new birth certificate or the equivalent, so it would say he was younger. And the comedy here is, with everyone maneuvering with their birth certificates, one time we had a situation where the father was at least officially younger than his own son. So you'll see how these kinds of things shouldn't be happening. Now, quite simply, and I could have started with this, but what makes this relevant, especially for all the students here, the purpose of this study is to look at why things have gone wrong and the way in which they have gone wrong, okay? And it's very difficult to do. Well, not only most American students wouldn't have any knowledge of this part of the world, I don't think, but the whole political beginnings of Cameroon are hard to imagine. And what makes Doh so special, it's not that he's so qualified, although his credentials are impeccable. It's the way he remembers things and has sort of an anecdotal style, okay? And says, can you imagine this could happen? It almost seems impossible. And his literature, as I understand it, seems to say the equivalent of what happens to quote unquote normal people when they are pushed off their game, in quotation marks. That's my phrase, okay? Pushed off their game. When something stressful happens that need not happen and takes an emotional toll away from one of the main characters. Now, maybe you can handle one misfortune, like the American equivalent of changing a flat tire or something like that. But at some point, okay, too many of these unfortunate problems are going to cause the dam to burst. And that dam will burst in a psychological fashion. That's my argument. And it threatens people's sanities. The French psychoanalyst and psychiatrist Jacques Lacan said the only thing which one can be guilty of is having to give ground relative to one's desire. And he says something like, yeah, there are obstacles, but the characters just don't have the opportunity to make their own decisions. I'm going to call that control, like a lack of control. But I don't mean the word control in an evil way or a manipulative way. I mean control kind of over your own destiny, okay? Control where you can use your own judgment and have a little bit of optimism in it. Instead, we're stuck. The Cameroonian society is stuck, and this kind of stuck always reminds me of Henry David Thoreau, who said most men live lives of quiet desperation. The stuck part means that people go around almost like zombies, maybe not quite that much, that may be extreme, where internally there are problems. People are suffering and they're suffering inward. Now, Mungeu, the main character, has to deal with repression and discord and lots of enemies. She has really not very much money. Her father won't educate her under the theory that she'll just meet a young man, get married, have babies, and that education will be wasted and the tuition will be wasted. So quite simply, she starts in the penalty box without her mother, and she can never really catch a break. And she suffers, and normally you would expect this to right itself, okay? And maybe that's the Western way, it's certainly the Hollywood way, but instead, it's like driving in a car with a GPS that can't make up its mind. Imagine you're driving and you have to make turns and the GPS can't make up its mind, or worse still, you can't hear clearly what it is telling you. Mungeu's family life is torn apart, okay? And as I mentioned earlier, it's hideous that her family does not show up for her graduation. And furthermore, a really big problem is, as a young girl or a young woman, really still in her teens, okay, nobody tells her about all of the issues about women and men and the biology therein. And with a formula like that, it shouldn't be a big surprise that she's in danger of becoming pregnant, and that's what happens. She's knocked up by an economics professor, which I really think is Emmanuel Fru Doh's way of hinting at something else, okay? The economics professor is a way of talking about the financial circumstances of Cameroon. And then when the economics professor goes to get an advanced degree in Europe, that point of storytelling should really be complete, okay? Now, if Africa were a fairy tale, none of these things would happen, or they would happen and at some point the ship would right itself. They say if you drop a cat from a distance before it hits the ground, it'll maneuver itself so it'll wind up with all four paws on the ground, okay? In this case, we have a woman whose psyche suffers. There's a famous gospel song that Mahalia Jackson sang in 1963 at the mall during the March on Washington, saying, quote, "Our souls look back and wonder how we got over." The idea, I believe, is getting over difficult things, okay? But it also presumes that the figure who is getting over can look back with some sort of satisfaction. Instead, the terrible truth is that Mungeu is delivered into a plague-filled land from which she can't be liberated. I wouldn't say that she's frightened of society, but she's clearly unprepared for it. And I've seen this both in novels and in real life. about people who will have childish thoughts, which is okay when you're a child, but they then take those thoughts into adulthood. And that's what happens here. So like a plant that's deprived of sunlight, she has to try as best she can to maneuver herself and figure out a way to handle these things. Okay. Oh, let's see. Okay. When Doe speaks of his own life and his own family, he writes about this, and he and I spoke about this. He mentions his father being a police officer back when he would have been about 5 years old. Okay.
Hold on, you are muted. Somebody muted you. I don't know how it happened.
Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know how that happened, but the idea that Emmanuel Fru Doh was able to enjoy his father and his family life, and it was a wonderful time where he would go around with his father at the police barracks, and they would run errands and get equipment. And you can only imagine how a young boy would enjoy being with his father under such a circumstance, and how his father would enjoy being with his son, of course. That doesn't even need any explanation. But at some point, this changed, and the police force became something in the manner of a modern day anti-terrorist group. And when we spoke of this, we were on Zoom, and all of this is in the transcript portion of the book. You could see his expression of exasperation. He's trying to convey how humiliating it is, or how sad it is, or how difficult it is to deal with something like this, and realize that there's no easy fix. My mind and my eyes are on the clock, so I want to make sure I cover everything I need. Professor Doe at one point says, kids were happy at one point growing up without these ridiculous divisions now characterizing the nation: Anglo, Frog, enemies in the house, come no go, Graphy, Sawa, and so on. The horrible abuses show that the nation has lost something, okay? It's lost its way, and just like, for example, a medical doctor has to go to undergraduate, then medical school, then residency, then, and before that, a specialty. There's an order of things. But here, there really is no order of things. So let me just try to finish up. And of course, I'll answer whatever questions you are about this. But the whole notion of rhythm, gone here, just not there. And what my writing tries to accomplish is to get everybody to realize how hard this is on the people. Okay. All of this stuff clutters the mind, and it's a tangled mess of emotional characters. Imagine a ball of twine that a cat has been playing with for 45 minutes, and your job is to order the twine or roll the twine back up so it's not tangled anymore. No one has the chance to sit and have a coffee and reflect on what's happening to him without being subjected to the tensions and pressures of everyday existence. This in-depth literary analysis is a withering gaze, and it has to do with surveillance, okay? There always seems to be somebody watching, okay? The police that were so wonderful at one point aren't anymore. Okay. And quite simply, when you want to get mad at somebody, you don't know who to get mad to. The whole system is so upsetting that you don't know what to do. I heard a story from someone else from Cameroon that somebody once went and put money into the bank at, let's say, 10 a.m., a lot of money, and then something happened where that was cash, by the way, he needed some of it later that very day, and the bank couldn't pay him. The bank no longer had the money they received, and he had to come back another day. Or worse yet, with Paul Biya, there was an incredible banking scandal where a bank just failed because they would make loans to members of the royal family or their friends, and those loans were sort of made with a wink. And the intention was never that they would be paid back. In other words, nothing flows anymore. Perhaps it hasn't flowed for a very long time. And Doh's job is to provide a journal or a series of writings that will help people scramble and find their way back. That's at least is the plan. For more than 60 years, Africans have been asking for permission to do their own thing in their own way, in their own language, in a land that belongs to no one else but them. It's probably hard for most Americans to imagine, but if somebody in Tuskegee wanted to write a letter to Cameroon, it would go to Paris, and then it would be routed to Cameroon. Okay, so quite simply, there's an element of organized crime here. There's an element of bad luck, of course. There's an element of seeing human beings that are at their worst. But before I finish, I do want to make this point. Just when you want to say things in Africa are terrible, and this is in Africa and Africa alone, you realize, or at least I realize, that these problems are universal. Look, for example, what's been going on in Jackson, Mississippi. How can the most wealthy nation in the entire world not have water for its people? Okay. And if you really focus your attention on what's going on, whether your politics are to the right or the left, nobody can say that America is functioning well right now. I don't think anybody who's 18 or older would come to that. So, can Cameroon find its way back? It has more than one language, French and English, and there's fighting. It has meddlesome business taking place from the French. And basically, the novels, while nostalgic, would like to bring people back or would like to bring the nation back. But by the time they end, and this I commend Doh for, he is realistic. He just doesn't sugarcoat things. And usually the endings are at best bittersweet. Okay. I asked Emmanuel Fru Doh at one point, is there something similar to what George Orwell had written? Is there something dystopian about this? And I don't think he expected that question, but he has a measure of hope, okay, that I don't think someone like George Orwell had. And we have here what seems like characters that are cornered. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? It's almost like at one point, Cameroon benefited just like King Arthur's Camelot. And just like Camelot, after one big event, or maybe several, things are ruined and the pieces can't be put back together again. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Fishkin, for your presentation. And I think I'll open the floor for commentaries and questions. And I see there is a raised hand. Or is that a clap? Oh, that's a clap.
That's a clap, Dr. Indy.
Thank you, that's a clap, thank you. So I open the floor, questioning and commentaries. And before I even open the floor, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Dean Prakash, Dr. Jimay, who joined us a little later. I need to acknowledge their presence equally. So any questions, comments, reflections on what we've heard? No questions? No comments?
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is Faye Hall Jackson, and I was just very much taken with, for lack of a better word, the exploration of culture, and just learning so much, or being exposed so much to nuances in culture that can be interpreted in so many different ways. So I thank you, Dr. Fishkin, for this discussion.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson.
This is Jimmy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Peace be unto you.
I'm also with you.
All right. Is when we hear the plethora or the litany of problems and issues, do you, in your work, do you find any oasis of something being done right somewhere? Any spark of hope anywhere?
I do. There are people that are wonderful, and they're helpful of each other on an individual level, but usually their gestures are overshadowed. For example, the character of Mabel in The Fire Within is Mungeu's older stepsister. She takes her in, she buys her clothes, she tries to help her. When she gets pregnant, there are positives, but I don't know what the right analogy is, but it's almost like there's a tidal wave hitting the shore, and some sandbags around a structure maybe won't help, or won't help enough. I won't spoil the ending of that novel. Another thing is, a lot of the characters, when things are not going well, they go to the bars where the alcohol is artificially cheap. You can probably imagine why that would be, but basically, I don't have statistics, but people in Cameroon drink a tremendous amount, and I think they're trying at some level to drink away their sorrows. So yes, there are positives, and yes, you'll hear good things, but I do remember Professor Doh saying that he went to school in Nigeria, and while the schools were wonderful, the schooling was wonderful, it set up an unpleasant thing, because it introduced him to how things ought to be taken care of. And then he had to go back to Cameroon, and it was just a mess. I guess the word I would say is it's Byzantine. It's circuitous, and there's no guarantee. Usually persistence is a plus. Ben Franklin said persistence is the best thing, or something like that. you can be persistent here and still fail. And it's very troubling.
All right. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Dr. Fishkin. I see, before I give the floor to any other person, I think I see Dr. Emmanuel Fru Doh's hand up. Let's hear from him.
Okay.
Dr. Fru Doh, you have the floor.
Thanks, Professor Bildi. I just want to say, I definitely have to commend Professor Fishkin for his insightful interpretation of the works. Sometimes I am amazed at how he's able to grasp the different angles or perspectives from which I was trying to attack what is going on in society. It is not the best, but I am hoping that with your study and with the people back in Cameroon reading, you would have done a really great job exposing what I am trying to tackle in a good number of these works. So I just want to say I wish you well, and I hope you will not turn away from, especially Cameroon literature, to try and see how you can continue exposing what is happening, especially to the locals themselves. I'm sincerely, can I say flattered by your insightful interpretation of the works. Something I didn't think. There are some of those things that even the natives have not been able, when I say natives, I mean those of us who are local to the country, have not been able to grasp, which you really brought out, especially when you talked to me. So my very best wishes to you as you continue in your struggles.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your help.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Doh. Thank you very, very much. So any other questions or comments?
Well, I have a question.
Dr. King, yes, go right ahead, Dr. King.
Thank you for organizing this conversation this afternoon. Dr. Fishkin, I was interested to hear more about your methodology. I think that's something that especially students present this afternoon could learn a bit about, since this is an interdisciplinary seminar. Could you talk a bit more about your methodology of putting your project together?
Well, I don't know where to start about that. As Victoria said, I started studying a lot of British literature in the 19th century. And at some point, I got interested in things going on in Africa. As you can tell, these novels are wonderful. I'm not going to say that they're going to make you feel good, but they are wonderful. And it's one of those things. I heard that when you start, like when a young person starts to read, the more they read, they will be led to better and better stuff. And what I tried to do is come up with an idea that I found interesting. And also, as part of it would be these kinds of situations where your reaction would be, oh, that can't possibly happen, or that this is being made up. And then you realize, of course, no, they're not being made up. But are you asking about like the kind of research I was involved with? Okay. There are 3 or 4 Cameroonian authors that I've read. Dr. Doh is one. Thomas Jing is one. Francis Namjo is one. Dr. Indy is one. And then there were others I came into touch with, like Beit Bissong and a few others. Basically, I tried to read all I could. And then once you have, the best analogy is Deacon Jones, the famous football player. He said he would grab the whole backfield and then discard 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 until he found the one with the ball. Now, of course, he's joking. A football player can't possibly do that. But I tried to separate what was valuable and interesting And a big thing for me is I don't like to get sidetracked. I don't like to get involved with something that might take my eye off the ball. And there were a lot of things that, yes, they're interesting. Yes, people are suffering, and that's important from a humanitarian standpoint. But in terms of getting something practical down on paper and then in print, it's trying to be focused. Like these characters, by the way, I mentioned predominantly women. There's a feminist angle to this. Why are the women suffering so much, so needlessly, so often? And that's a wonderful, wonderful point, but that can get subsumed or by the politics. And you start looking at the politics where Cameroon's president spends weeks at a time at Switzerland's nicest hotel in the penthouse with 40 hangers on. All the while, the people are at home not eating 3 meals a day. That's the kind of issue that some might say that's going to catch someone's attention maybe more than the plight of the woman, but it's no less important.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Salau. I see your hand up. So unmute yourself. Dr. Salau, we can hear you.
He about to pass out. He wiped his face. He all right?
Hello?
Dr. Salau? All right. Yeah, I can see. Now unmute yourself and talk. Let's hear. Unmute. Maybe check your volume.
He probably gonna need some headphones.
Do you have headphones, Dr. Salau? All right, while waiting for Dr. Salau to get his headphones, any other question? All right. No, we still cannot hear you. Do you want to type your question on the chat and then I'll
Yeah,
read it?
that would be great if you can.
All right, while waiting for Dr. Salau, I think it is Ms. Ortega or Dr. Ortega is asking you the names of the novels.
The novels, okay. There were 3 primary ones that I work from, all by the same author. One was Nomads, one was The Fire Within, and one was Boundaries.
And there is another question, which I almost missed. There were questions on the chat that you should elucidate a little bit about the fascination with Cameroon?
You know,
What is the fascination with Cameroon?
what is my fascination with Cameroon?
Yeah.
I think it has something to do with the individuals seem to be tapping into this issue of nostalgia. If they're at a certain age, they can remember back to when things were so wonderful. And this idea that now they are gone and there seems to be no way back. There's something very similar to this and something that Thomas Wolfe, the famous author, wrote about that, you know, you can't go home again. You know, you want to go home, you want things to be as you remember them, but that's not the way it is. This issue of having your right foot in one era and your left foot in another, and how hard that is, I think that's got an awful lot to do with my my interest.
Okay, thank you. We finally got Dr. Salah's comment.
And
the comment states the greatest burden of society affects women. Thanks for highlighting that. You still want to say something about that regarding your research?
Okay, I didn't say very much about that until the end because there's only so much time, but you get the impression that the women aren't treated well at all. Okay, for example, the Fire Within, you have a pregnant teen, no help, no money, no education, and you have to say to yourself, boy, what could be worse, or what could go wrong that's further, what further thing could go wrong? And I think what I didn't talk about is when Mungeu is pregnant the second time, when she makes an attempt to abort a pregnancy, the nurses or the doctors or the people at the hospital, they won't treat her at all unless she's in pain in her hospital bed, unless she actually admits that she had attempted to abort this pregnancy. They won't help her at all, and they take a big back step. Now that's of course an extreme example, but you know, you don't have to be African. You can look at what's going on now politically in our country. I just think society, for whatever reason, it's a terrible flaw, doesn't feel comfortable with women making their own decisions and doing their own thing. And it's a terrible thing.
Okay. Any other question?
A comment question, just a reflection here on what Dr. Fishkin has done. And I'm connecting with Professor Doh's comment with respect to hopefully the nationals can see it and it can be of use to the society. So apart from the intellectual value or the academic value of literary analysis, Professor Fishkin, could you tell us whether literature in society really does make a difference? And maybe you can link it up with your experience with the US. Because when Professor Doh made that point, I said, because he said you're able to see it, and maybe the nationals will get it later, or will read this later, and it might make an impact. So society and literature and society, where do you see it really being of practical value in terms of the US experience and what it might mean for Cameroon, which of course, Professor Doh's thing is aspirational. We all hope that.
Okay, let's see if I can tackle this. Yes, I think literature has a value But this I can, maybe Dr. Indy can comment on. I just think though, however, these days, maybe technology's got something to do with it. Fewer and fewer people are reading books or are not aware of things that they ought to be aware of. I'll just mention, and it just happened today, so I'll throw this out there. You can take it for what you will about reading and being informed. One of my students said they had never heard of Richard Nixon. Now, that's startling to me, but I don't think people in the United States do a lot of reading, and certainly less than maybe they did in the 50s or 60s. And that's a terrible thing. As far as Cameroon is concerned, I don't know, Dr. Indy, maybe you can answer this. People getting access to sensitive books and such, can they do that easily?
All right, you're throwing this question to me,
Yeah,
but I would like to add to the question Dr.
sure.
asked you, because a twist, you touched on something and I expected you to expatiate.
I can do that.
No, at this point, look at what is happening in the US, all right, where women's rights are being taken
Yeah,
completely. It is something that, from Doh's perspective, Doh has decried that. First of all, as a male feminist, he decries that, right? It is for the audience, for the US audiences now to realize that what is happening to them here is not something that is not happening elsewhere. It is happening, but should not take it just lying down. They should not just accept it. There are ways of fighting it. And it is almost like Doh's work is a rallying cry for all and sundry, men and women, to stand up for women's rights. And I think when Dr. Jimmy asked about the take on literature, we should look at that universal aspect of literature, not just it is happening in Cameroon. It is happening in Cameroon, but what is happening in Cameroon is reflective of what is happening here. Let's not forget, as a scholar of globalization, I always say a sneeze in China, we would catch a cold in the US, right?
sure.
If you look at what has happened recently with car prices, just because the microchips that cars are used, they use in making cars, there was disruption in supply. We could no longer have them. So literature, its impact on societies, not just society, is phenomenal. And we cannot limit our scope or our literature to just one little bit of nation or national literature or provincial literature.
Yeah, I wanted to, I was reluctant to say more about the woman's issue and you know, the Roe v. Wade debate in the country, and there are even people in the country that want contraception to be eliminated. I didn't want to really get too political. I didn't know if that's my role here or not. But as far as the literature is very powerful. These are powerful voices, but they're only powerful if people are going to really be reading. And I hope they are, but I don't get that impression, honestly. I'm just telling you my personal observation.
Okay.
But literature is a wonderful tool. This goes back to you know, Emile Zola, you know, the way getting people to react and be aware of bad things. But to be honest, you know, there are no bookshops anymore. When I was a child, I loved going to a bookstore where you could be surrounded by books. There are none, or not very many of them anymore. So anyway, I hope I answered Dr. Jimmy's question.
All right, there is another bigger question And this one from Dr. Hassan, who says, Professor Fishkin, granted your fascination with Cameroon, are there any possibility of your initiating projects through which Cameroonian scholars, especially back in Cameroon, could partner with you in bringing to the limelight, I dare say, globalizing British Southern Cameroon's literature, of which Fru Doh is just one of its writers?
I would love that. I tried very hard to go to Cameroon in 2017, I think it was.
2016.
And I would love to work with more Cameroonian writers, you know, were that possible. That would be wonderful. And it would be interesting to see what are the young people there thinking and writing about. Someone who's 25, let's say, you know, somebody who grew up after and was born after the 1992 election, which many think was misconstrued. That would be a wonderful thing.
Okay. Any other questions, commentaries? Well, if there are no questions, just going one, going two, three. I would thank all of you for coming. Thank you for your participation, the questions. I hope the discussion was robust, and there will be many more university interdisciplinary seminar series coming up. Just look up for them. I will be sending information out each time we have one. Just so you know, there should be one coming up on the 7th of October, Friday, talking about the uncanonized saint of abolitionism, who John Woolman is. So we'll be looking forward to another robust discussion. I thank you for your coming and look forward to seeing you next time. You have a blessed and wonderful day. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. I'm in your debt. Thank you.